Hello and welcome to EuropeChats, where we unpack the key issues shaping Europe and its place in the world. This episode focuses on transatlantic relations, recorded at the end of June 2025, 5 months into the second presidency of Donald Trump. We'll take a step back to examine the foundations of the EU-US relationship, shared values, strategic cooperation, and economic interdependence. But we will also look ahead at the pressures, shifts, and possible futures. Our guest is Professor Erik Jones, an American political economist and one of Europe's leading experts on European integration. Based at the European University Institute in Florence, where he directs the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies, Erik brings both a transatlantic perspective and a deep understanding of European integration. I'm also joined by Jim Cloos, TEPSA Secretary-General and former Director-General at the General Secretariat of the Council of the European Union, whom many of you already know from previous EuropeChats. Erik, the relationship between the United States and Europe was largely shaped in the wake of the Second World War. As you've pointed out in our recent book, transatlantic partners built a global economy in their own image, relied on liberal democratic institutions to underpin popular legitimacy, and established and enforced international law. Well, today you argue all these foundations are under strain, and the emergence of figures like Trump is more symptom than the cause. Could you tell us more about the fundamental logic of the post-war transatlantic relationship and why the West may no longer hold together?
So it's a good question with a slightly complicated answer, because at the end of the Second World War, the United States and its European allies faced a particular challenge coming out of the Soviet Union, which was to shore up domestic legitimacy at home, to create an international division of labor so that they could all prosper and build up the resources that they need, a big part of shoring up that domestic legitimacy, and to provide for security. In doing those three things at the same time, what they needed was an economic relationship that brought both sides of the Atlantic together to create the prosperity that allowed politicians on each side of the Atlantic to do what they needed with that prosperity to shore up domestic legitimacy, and then to invest a significant amount of that prosperity in security. What happens at the end of the Cold War is that we discover these things are not working as harmoniously as they should be. The prosperity that's being generated is not shoring up domestic legitimacy. In fact, significant parts of the population on both sides of the Atlantic are looking at the international economy and saying, this is not giving us what we want. And it's also not generating enough wealth to invest easily in security. It's not giving us the kind of security that we need. And without those three things coming together, the cohesiveness of the transatlantic relationship is actually diminishing, and it has been for the better part of almost 4 decades.
Well, we'll come back to that. But meanwhile, Jim, why was the US actually interested in European economic and political integration, and how did they support the process?
The United States was the new superpower after the Second World War. So obviously, they wanted to shape the world in their best interests, which is entirely natural. Now, I must say that the post-war American political generation was quite outstanding because they understood a certain number of things. The first thing they understood is not to redo Versailles, the peace treaty after the First World War, because they had understood that if they wanted to have this world, you needed to bring a country like Germany back into the fold and work with them and make them an ally. So that was the first thing. The second thing was geopolitics, of course. The Americans knew that there was hostile, or sooner or later going to be hostile again, USSR, and there was China behind it. So it was in the core American interest to have a kind of bridgehead, a solid bridgehead in Europe, on the western European tip of the continent, in what is Eurasia. So that was a very geopolitical link. And of course, linked to that, the Americans provided security for that part. And they wanted to have people who were listening to what they wanted to do. Now, initially, the idea was to have a European army with the European defense community, which failed. The Americans supported that, by the way, but it didn't work. And then, of course, the orientation was we do this together in a transatlantic organization, which is called NATO, which provides security to the Europeans who can, under this umbrella, build up their system. And the third point was economic prosperity, which you mentioned, which was very important, of course, for the Americans. And again, they had the intelligence to build up a new multilateral system with the United Nations, with the IMF, with the World Bank, etc., which was based on law, or let's put it this way, based to some extent on law, because whenever the Americans felt constrained by it, they went outside. And now, of course, over the years, as they controlled it less and less, they've gone more outside. Now, this system worked brilliantly for the two sides for many decades. And we should, as Europeans, recognize this. But of course, it could not go on eternally. It looked as though after the fall of the Soviet Union, the West had won, end of history and all of that, which was, of course, a total illusion. That was the time when the Europeans should have remained very close to the United States, but started emancipating and doing much more for their own conventional defense. I think NATO should have slowly withered away, but of course that's now a completely different issue, which has happened because of everything which has happened in Yugoslavia, in Georgia, in Ukraine, etc. We're now again in a very different world. But what remains is, it is not natural that a rich organization or continent like Europe should depend totally for its hard security on a third power, even if it's a close third power. And today, the United States is no longer a close power. That's the way I would put it.
On security, we will come back as well. But now, Erik, President Trump has reversed pretty much all the better things that the US represented on the global stage. Why are his nationalistic and antagonistic policies so popular?
I mean, popular in the United States. I'm not sure all of his nationalistic and antagonistic policies are popular in the United States. I'm not sure that his trade policy is popular at all. But these are things that feature in the Trump administration because of the way the Trump administration and the president himself perceive this notion of America first. And that is, I have to say, an attractive slogan for many people in the United States. So the idea that you put American interests above all else, because they look back at this situation that Jim described as a situation where European dependence was actually taking priority over American need. And that's what they would like to reverse. So if you were to ask people in the United States what they think of the European Union, for example, you would find many people who think the European Union has been free riding on American security and on American prosperity.
Is there some truth in that?
Well, I think there is and there isn't. For one thing, I have a hard time distinguishing between the U.S. and the European economy. If you look at the level of investment by Americans in Europe and Europeans in the United States, and the level of wealth that cross-Atlantic investment generates, it's many times greater than the trade that takes place between those two parts of the Atlantic. And these economies are deeply integrated in terms of the way they create jobs, in the way they create investment, and in the way they shape the rules that govern the world writ large. And so in that sense, I don't think it is Europe taking advantage of the United States. I think it's actually Europe and the United States actually building something that both benefit from significantly. But explaining that is obviously hard to do.
Well, Jim, what are the main common interests between the US and Europe?
It's a good question. I think Erik put it very well. This was very much something which was dominated by the United States, but it was mutually beneficial. Over time, this has eroded to some extent, and now we are in a very difficult situation. And I will say a few tough things because I think in the longer term perspective, our relationship with the Americans, it will not survive if we do not, or it will survive and we are just be vessels. And this is very unhealthy. It's never good for a long time. We need to be much stronger as Europeans. So now if I look at the common interests and values, you have to put the two together here. Let me quickly go through a few points. In terms of geopolitics, we should not forget that already in 2011, Obama, not Trump, Obama, practiced the Asia pivot, where basically the Americans were saying, okay, Europe should be able now to sort out itself. We have to concentrate on Asia and other places, which was not a stupid idea, frankly, but it should have already made the Europeans reflect. But the Europeans basically ignored it and say, we'll go on as usual. That was the first thing. The second thing is on the security. Okay, we're still allies in NATO. We still have Article 5, but we have doubts about it. And now, if I put it starkly, I am worried about a new deal offered by Trump, which would be one, you pay for your own defense. I say, yes, of course, we should, and we have enough money, no problem. Two, and here it becomes much more problematic, don't count on automatic Article 5 application. I mean, he called into doubt Article 5 of NATO. I mean, I'm putting it starkly, but that's the way. And the third thing is, and regardless of what's going on, you continue to align on everything to the United States.
Well, we'll go into that as well. But do you see still some common interests?
Yes. I come to the third point, which is the economy. Yes, you're right. It is a huge interdependence. Just give you two figures. Overall trade, goods and services, is about 1.6 to 1.8 trillion a year. Mutual investments, mutual foreign direct investments stands at 4.7 trillions. That is absolutely massive. So obviously, and this is for the Americans, it's important for us. But again, one of the founding elements of this is an international multilateral system which works, its openness, its open trade. And I'm sorry, what presently we see from Washington does not go in this direction. The taxes, the tariffs. I am a bit afraid that the Europeans, maybe I'm wrong, but I have the impression we've bought part of his argument. The 10% compared to what happens between developed countries today is quite outrageous. I think it's a very negative move, generally speaking. Secondly, 25% on steel, automobiles and things like that, justified by security issues, national security, is of course a very strange statement if you apply it to countries with which you are in a defense community like NATO. Very, very strange. So we should ask ourselves questions. And the tariffs à la carte are just completely absurd and completely disrupting the world economy. So on all of those issues, and there's a last point which is quite important, is the values. But I have problems. What I see is, at least the present administration, is systematic attacks against everything the EU represents. Direct interventions in our elections and supporting in Germany AfD, in Poland PiS, etc., etc. Is that normal? Do we accept that? Secondly, it goes much further than that. There is an active effort of the people around Vance and others to build up an ideological counterpart to the EU as it is, and they work with Ordo Iuris. I mean, there are think tanks from Poland, from PiS, Corvinus from Hungary, who issued a paper which they first published in the United States a year ago. Now it's come out here, which is about the future of the EU, and it's the complete dismantling of the EU. Only unanimity, opt-outs for everybody who wants it, and a consultative role for the European Court of Justice. Now, that is a shared transatlantic community approach, I struggle. And I do not have the solutions, but we should at least show a minimum of lucidity, like the French say, and understand what's going on.
Well, Jim spoke a lot about the frustrations of Europeans. Are there similar frustrations in the US vis-a-vis Europe?
I think to the extent that anybody in the United States actually understands how the European Union functions, there is a significant frustration with the slowness of the decision-making, with the emphasis on regulation as opposed to action. And I think that this division of labor in terms of security is hard to explain in an American context. It's funny, though. Jim was talking earlier about Article 5, right? In Article 5 of the NATO treaty is actually a weaker security commitment than the security commitment that's embedded in the Treaty on European Union. The Treaty on European Union uses language that's much stronger than Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And that difference is intentional on the Article 5 side, because the language in the Treaty on the European Union was written in 1948 as part of the Brussels Treaty Organization. The language in the NATO treaty was written in 1949, and the Americans looked at the European language and said, we can never sell that at home. And so the Europeans have a stronger security commitment. They just don't have the ability to make good on it.
But they also mention in this treaties NATO as an ultimate defense organization.
Actually, no. I mean, the
They
thing
do.
about,
It's in the treaties.
Oh, yes,
but,
it is. Yeah.
but not in the 1948 treaty, because NATO didn't exist, right? And what's interesting about having NATO as the sort of guarantor of security in Europe is the logic behind it, right? I mean, the logic comes out of nuclear deterrence. You have to have a credible doctrine for nuclear first use. And the Europeans do not have that. Not nuclear first use, but nuclear use. And the Europeans do not have that. And NATO does. And so if we're going to live in a nuclear world where we have a nuclear deterrence, we have to rely on an organization that has a credible doctrine. And the problem with what the Trump administration is doing, and here I think Jim is absolutely right, they're drawing into question this Article 5 commitment, but that means they're also drawing into question the credibility of nuclear doctrine, and therefore the credibility of the deterrent. That's a terrible thing. For Europeans to replace it, even if they keep NATO, they wouldn't need NATO anymore. Because if they come up with their own credible nuclear deterrent, then the logic of having NATO as the security guarantor ceases to exist. And Europe becomes truly autonomous. And that, I think, is where Jim is headed. And you have to ask yourself, will a future United States be comfortable with an independent European nuclear deterrent?
I wanted to ask about that, actually. In terms of security, what does the US really expect from Europe in terms of taking more responsibility for the security? Because we get some mixed signals there. Does it expect continuous purchases of US military equipment? And in a way, is this a payment for the continued nuclear deterrence that the US is providing for Europe?
So think about it this way, right? The United States wants to be in alliance with Europe, but it wants Europe to do the routine, mundane stuff of security provision and allow the United States to do the sexy, innovative, dynamic stuff. And it wants the Europeans to provide the personnel and the material, but it wants the United States to provide the command, control, intelligence, and all the rest. And every time we have these burden-sharing debates, and the United States says to the Europeans they need to spend more money, the Europeans say, okay, we're going to start building really sexy stuff, and we're going to build out our own command, control, and intelligence. And the United States, no, don't do that. Spend your money on more troops and tanks and stuff like that, right? And unfortunately, you can't build a credible nuclear deterrent on the stuff the Americans want the Europeans to buy and build, right? And so if the Europeans are going to build a credible nuclear deterrent, they will actually have to build stuff that competes directly in those spaces where the United States predominates. And this is going to be a source of tension because it's going to be stuff that Europeans have to build domestically, right? So you look at this giant bunker-busting bomb that the United States has dropped on Iran. Imagine the Europeans investing a lot of money in building that, right? The United States had 20 of those in its arsenal before this attack on Iran. Probably half of them are used up. That's why they're so freakishly expensive. If the Europeans started spending money on that, I think that would cause huge consternation in the United States. They'd be like, why don't you just buy it from Boeing instead, right? And I don't think the European Union, if it wants to become a credible security entity, can afford to do that. So I expect this to create a lot of tension because of a lot of disappointment in the United States with the way Europeans are going to spend money on their own security.
Going back to the basic common interest, are there still people in the US, influential people in businesses, in financial sector, in the Congress, who still believe in some basic common interest between the US and Europe?
But think about all the money we were talking about that's being invested across the Atlantic. In business, the business community is looking at this and thinking, wow, what are we going to do? Most of the trade across the Atlantic is within firms, not between firms. So the business community is saying, wait a minute, we specialized in building a fleet of automotives that we could sell to the public. But that fleet only exists if we can trade across the Atlantic. We have to reorganize everything in order to offer the same variety to American consumers. So yeah, and the values that we cherish are values that are not unique to Europe and the United States, but they are values that Americans and Europeans hold dearly, like the protection of human rights. I mean, even at its worst, the Trump administration has to admit that most Americans believe that children should not be made to work in factories anywhere. Most Americans believe that people should not be allowed to starve to death anywhere. And Europeans share that view. And when we extend it into peace and freedom and stuff like that, you can always find a vast majority of Americans who believe that people should be free, right to assembly, freedom of expression, things like that. They differ in the way they think it should be expressed, but they believe in it, and so do Europeans. And these things are things that we believe together. I'm not saying other parts of the world don't believe this stuff. I'm saying that the Europeans and Americans share many more common conceptions of these values than are shared in other parts of the world.
Well, Jim, many Europeans have long imagined and talked about strategic autonomy. Do you think it's realistic for Europe to pursue full strategic autonomy, or would you say that Europe has no other choice than to keep the US engaged in a revived partnership?
Strategic autonomy is an absolute must, whatever happens on the other side of the Atlantic, because it's because the way the world is and the way things are going. So the question for me is, are we going to do it? How? Or are we not? If we are not, you can forget about the EU as a global player, which has enormous consequences for our interests and our values. Now, I want to come back briefly to what Erik said about defense, because it was really interesting. And I very much agree with the way he presented this kind of constant tension between the Europeans and the Americans. What do you really want of us, and why don't you do what we need, and things like that is very true. And very often I have understood American frustration. But to come back to the core situation, Erik is right that Article 42.7 of the treaty is quite strong in the way. But this is what the Europeans, we are very good in having strong principles and slogans. The problem is how to implement them. We're quite weak at that. And this is one of those cases. Here, obviously, and you were right to point out that, of course, in the treaty, the European treaties, you have a direct reference to the importance of NATO for most of our member countries. So they are intimately linked, and you cannot completely divorce them. Now, for me as a European, the one thing, we should not start from the wrong end and start about a nuclear bomb in Europe and things like that. It poses so many problems. The one thing where everybody agrees, even the Americans, is capabilities. Spend a bit more, a bit. I'm very skeptical about the 5%, but a bit more, and use the 450 billion, which the Europeans, together with, including Turks and the British, are now spending on defense. That should be more than enough to develop drones and things like that. I don't think we should have too many tanks around. But okay, so that is what we have to do. And this is important for the following reason. If in some way or other, I'm quite skeptical now on the long-term relationship with the United States on this, but I hope I'm wrong. If it holds, basically, with some changes, then these capabilities by the Europeans is strengthening the alliance, our joint security. If not, it's a reassurance policy. So that is the most important thing to do now.
Do you think this capability should be developed within NATO or outside?
I am totally agnostic about that. It depends on how NATO develops. You could have a European pillar in NATO. I don't want to get into this because it doesn't matter.
Well, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, it makes a difference. But the starting point has to be this we must do regardless. If we stay within NATO, because the Europeans are not going to take the initiative of scuppering NATO or working out of NATO. That will come only from the other side. So we should build on that. Now, then there are questions with the Americans. And I think Erik alluded to this. What is this defense effort for? Let's take 5%. I find it, because my fear is that the Americans are asking us more and more and more to do while not providing the security guarantee? Because you said it's a sort of paying for the security thing. I think they want the best of all worlds and not provide the guarantee, but make us pay for everything. Now, the 5% in a nutshell, what is it for? Is it to be able to defend ourselves conventionally against Putin? Putin has a budget of 120 and 30 billion, and he will have trouble keeping that up for a very long time. We have 450 billion now. So frankly, we should be capable of doing this. The question is, of course, the nuclear thing behind. So we'll have a big transition from it. So is it just to buy more weapons from the United States or not? For me, it can only work. And our societies will not and should not accept that this money mainly goes to the United States. We must have a really European defense industry. It's now really time to do it. And the second question I would ask to Trump, and that's where we come into the big geopolitical game, or is the idea behind it that for a possible future war with China, you want to have the Europeans fighting with you? I mean, this is a very tough question, and I don't think any politician would raise it, but I do raise it. We should ask the right questions in the present circumstances on defense.
Erik, do you think that Europe has the tools, the means, and the mindset to defend its own continent against Russia?
Absolutely. I mean, first, I'm old enough to remember the sort of Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus, which I always found, frankly, absurd, right? I mean, yes, the Europeans were happy to live in a Pacific world that was based on international law, or at least some loose framing of a rules-based international system. But Europeans are capable of incredible violence. We shouldn't forget that. In big part of the reason why the United States during the Cold War was quite content to play a leading role in providing European security is because it worried about how much Europeans would worry one another by building up huge military presence, right? Particularly in Germany. Let's not forget the whole agreement that came into place after the European defense community was critically based on constraints on German military rearmament. So we can rearm Europe if we want to, right? It's like putting water on the Furbies, right? We can rearm it, but we shouldn't be surprised if Europe begins to use that assertively. Jim was talking earlier about the fact that Donald Trump and the MAGA movement in the United States is making all of these connections to European political parties. I think we should accept that those values are also shared across the Atlantic. In part of the post-war settlement was for Europeans to keep those values out of the political system. That was an explicit requirement from the United States to keep both right and left-wing extremists out of the political system. And when that didn't happen, the American government would step in and prevent communists from joining political governments, right? And so I think, what we're looking at is a complete volte-face, right? A complete about-face in American attitudes. Oh no, bring the extremists in. Okay, but if we do that, is the United States really ready to deal with the consequences of European political extremism, particularly when married with advanced industrial economies and huge military capability?
Well, you said Europeans are capable of violence. I mean, if they are so capable to defend Europe, why aren't they playing a bigger role in Ukraine? Especially as the outcome of the war in Ukraine actually is going to determine pretty much European security or insecurity.
But, I think we have to face the harsh reality that nobody wants to send their sons or daughters to go fight for an idea if they're gonna die. And the time when that was considered a glorious death has long since passed, and thank goodness. But unfortunately, Europeans are going to have to relearn that, and relearning that is going to be a very painful process. And once it's relearned, the anger that is associated with that pain is going to be considerable. And you look at the situation in Ukraine, for example, where they are relearning that. Let's not forget the Ukrainians never imagined that Russia was going to invade until Russia did. And then now they are in a situation where they are experiencing the need to sacrifice their own citizens for their own security. And it's a horrible experience, and it will transform their societies. And if we go through that transformative process in Europe, and I say we because I live here, right? Then we should expect a very different kind of European culture to emerge from that. And so, yes, I'm sad that they're not doing more to protect Ukraine, but I'm also cautious that if they were more enthusiastic, what would that represent in terms of their desire to go into force projection as opposed to other ways of addressing international relations?
What is the point where you think they would get more enthusiastic?
I'm just going to throw it out there, right? If Article 5 is breached and not respected, so if Russia pushes into Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania or Poland, right? Then I think Europeans will wake up. They will have to, because they will be faced with the stark choice. Do we admit that we are incapable of defending ourselves and accept the predation that this represents? And they keep pretending that Ukraine is an exception right now. But they couldn't pretend it's an exception in that context. And once they face that choice, it's going to go one of two ways. Either they're going to realize they need to do this, or what I would consider the worst case scenario, the European Union is going to break on this issue.
There are many things in what you said which I find interesting. I mean, first of all, the idea that the Europeans are pacifists is, of course, completely absurd. I mean, just go to Africa, Latin America, Asia, and ask them whether Europeans are violent or not. I mean, I'm sorry. So the only thing is, after the Second World War, with the help of the Americans, we have found a different way of channeling our
Just
violence.
to be clear, like, I don't think violence is and value, but
Well,
but self-defense is important.
But my second point is linked to that. My second point is that I am deeply convinced that we must adapt to a world which is more brutal, which is multipolar in things, and some of what you said, I agree. This being said, I'm still maybe naively hoping that we can both become stronger and more of a serious actor and defend ourselves and preserve our DNA and our values, our way of working together. I do not believe in the United States of Europe. We should not become like the United States, because the situation is the historic situation is very different. I think we'd break up Europe. So I would say we must get stronger, but we should continue wherever possible to work on multilateral. When we cannot be autonomous, look, we are doing this in trade. We were the champions of multilateralism over the last 10 years because we had to. We adopted a dozen texts about autonomous measures to defend ourselves against, at the time it was mainly seen, the Chinese. Today I would include the Americans. Even now on the question of Ukraine, where the Europeans and the Americans had a common position, it's no longer true. What has Trump done so far? He has basically vindicated the Putin rhetoric. That's huge. We have not. And luckily, that's the one thing where we have not followed, and we should not follow him. He's constantly attacking Zelensky in a way which is undermining the defense. And we don't know what's going on the ground. Now, the Europeans, this is a very difficult situation for the reasons which Erik gave. It's not very simple. And of course, the fact is, Russia is a nuclear power. So there are many, many issues there. And I don't know how this is going to pan out. And everything which goes on today in Iran, with Iran and the way Israel behaves and Gaza comes at a huge cost for European credibility, which will have a repercussion on our credibility as far as Ukraine is concerned. I'm deeply worried about that. But maybe we should have another talk to go into that area, because for me, it is a real catastrophe. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's of course true, and very good that Europe didn't follow Trump rhetoric. But on the other hand, what are kind of more serious military assistance and security guarantees that Ukraine can provide? Sorry, that is Europe can provide to Ukraine in the absence of the US?
Short term, we have a big transition problem because we're not ready. Let's be honest. That's the point. And you're not becoming ready in 1 year. I am deeply convinced that if the Germans invest into industry and all that, I mean, We will easily match the Russians in 5-10 years. We now have a problem. We don't have enough soldiers ready because we didn't invest in this. We don't have, we have too many defense systems. We're not coordinated enough, and we don't have the nuclear part, which is still. So I still hope that even with someone like Trump, that the Americans will not completely walk out of this, but I'm not certain about it. But in any way, in any event, we will have to work towards more autonomy. I conclude with that. More autonomy for me requires, it's not an absolute concept, it's a relative concept. We don't want to decouple from the world, be it the Chinese or the Americans or anybody. It's relative. We will continue doing trade and invest in trade. It's in our interest and being internationalists. But it's about the capacity to act. You need a frame of mind, and that's what we've been mainly talking about. How does the world go? How is the transatlantic relationship going? We need a method. We have to be much more systematic in looking at our policies. We have often in this place talked about this. Look at our strengths and leverage them. Look at our weaknesses and fight them. I take trade, defense, those issues will really have to get going. And at the end, the Europeans will have to revise their governance, particularly their governance in running external relations, much closer cohesion between policies which are run by different rules, much closer cohesion between what goes on in Brussels and in the member states, and overcoming these ridiculous fights on external representation. There are so many that representatives that, we have many voices everywhere in the G7, in the G20, and think we are quantitatively overrepresented, which means we are qualitatively underrepresented. We should have a serious look at that.
Erik, final question to you. What are the key policy steps that Europe should take in order to be stronger on its own?
Well, I think Europe has already started taking them. I mean, these are changes to procurement to privilege locally produced content, particularly in the security sector. These are changes to competition rules to allow greater concentration in the security sector. These are changes in the way we think about supply chain management so that we get more of the security sector located in Europe and across member states. So everybody is bought into this. In a lot of this stuff is very slow moving, but the European Union specializes in long-term projects based on very small decisions that add up cumulatively into great transformation. You look at the completion of the internal market, it took 15 years for Europe to become a world leader in regulation and standard setting. And if we start the process now, seeing Europe as a world leader in security is not beyond the realm of imagination. It just takes a lot of consistent, coherent effort.
Thank you so much, Jim and Erik, for this timely discussion. And thank you all for watching. We will be back with further Europe Chats in the fall. Stay tuned.